My name is Jamario Mathis. My book study was The Great Chicago Fire and the Myths of Mrs. O'Leary's Cow by Richard F. Bells. This book is less a study about the fire than it is a study to discover the origin of the fire and either credit or discredit all the accounts that have since been recorded around the cause of the fire and all the activity that followed. The most prominent theory on the cause of the fire is a kicked over milk can by a cow owned by Mrs. Catherine O'Leary, an Irish immigrant living in Chicago. Bell states from the beginning that he does not believe that the fire was started by Mrs. O'Leary and her cow. He discusses the many recorded accounts of Mrs. O'Leary and points out the inconsistencies around that theory. The original rumor was that Mrs. O'Leary was in her barn late at night milking one of her cows when the cow kicked over the lantern and began the blaze that would eventually destroy most of Chicago over the next 3 days. Through a lengthy process of finding conflicting stories and unsubstantiated evidence, Bells concludes that the fire was accidentally started, not by Mrs. O'Leary, but by a neighbor of the O'Learys, Daniel Pegleg Sullivan. Sullivan was actually the one that initially discovered the fire in the barn of the O'Learys. One of the most incriminating evidences against Sullivan was the fact that Sullivan claims he saw the fire beginning in the barn from his house, but the barn is not actually visible from Sullivan's house. Bell's conclusion that Mrs. O'Leary and her cow are innocent and the perpetrator of the fire is more likely Mr. Sullivan seems logical to me. As noted by Smithsonian.com, it is highly unlikely that Mrs. O'Leary would not have alerted someone or sought out help if she had accidentally started a fire in her barn. Interestingly, there are no actual photos of the fire, only drawings based on accounts of it. So many of the details of the fire's growth and spread have been told and retold that it is difficult at this time to determine exactly what is factual. John Polly of American Quarterly said it best in 1984. The very circumstances of the fire lent themselves to such myth making. The destruction of the most successful and representative city of the West, the biblical overtones of city being ravaged by fire, the apparent unity of the entire country in aiding Chicago, the role of the railroad and telegraph in speeding relief, all these features recommended the fire as a topic of discussion. Reading Bell's account of the fire points out several shortcomings of Chicago in emergency management. There were issues in the areas of mitigation, preparedness, and response. Primarily, the focus for Bells was in the mitigation phase. He, like many that have studied the fire, pointed to the almost totally wood construction of the city and the flammable contents of its buildings as the main cause of the total destruction of the fire. The Chicago Tribune wrote on the day after the fire that it was constructed not with oaken beams and flooring, but an aggregation of flimsy constructed and inflammable pine. Also noteworthy in the risky design and construction of the city are the many underground passageways throughout the city, also constructed mainly of wood. At the time of the fire, these underground walkways served to create vacuum tunnels for the fire to travel through, unreachable by fire rescue. Realizing this, the Board of Police and fire commissioners had lobbied for more fire hydrants and less flammable construction materials, but were unsuccessful in having regulations passed. The images here show before and after pictures from prominent locations in Chicago. Hydrants are not apparent, and the destruction of the buildings illustrated the concerns voiced by the Board of Commissioners. Not only did the city of Chicago not have an effective evacuation plan, but many citizens chose to take advantage of the pandemonium during the fire and resort to criminal behavior. History.com states the disaster prompted an outbreak of looting and lawlessness. Companies of soldiers were summoned to Chicago and martial law was declared on October 11, ending 3 days of chaos. Martial law was lifted several weeks later. Bell's treatment of the Chicago fire was written to disprove the theory of Mrs. O'Leary's cow. In the process of exonerating the poor cow and its owner, Bells revealed the emergency management procedures were greatly lacking in Chicago in 1871. Mitigating shortcomings. The almost entirely wood-constructed city with an unsatisfactory number of fire hydrants was an unsafe hazard waiting to happen. Even though the city officials were warned of the dangers, nothing was done in regards to making the city safer. Preparedness shortcomings. Ignoring the request of Board of Commissioners for money to allocate for hydrants and the advice to use alternate building materials other than wood for the city's construction was a decision that ultimately cost Chicago billions of dollars. With better allocations of funds, much of the damage and destruction caused by the fire could have been avoided. Response shortcomings. Failure to have an adequate alert and evacuation system resulted in large loss of life. The fire started late at night when many residents of Chicago were sleeping. There was no large-scale plan for alerting the city of emergency and no plan for an orderly evacuation. As a result of the chaos that ensued, looting and lawlessness following the fire went undeterred for days. I hope you enjoyed this book review of The Great Chicago Fire and the Myth of Mrs. O'Leary's Cow by Richard Bells. Please leave your thoughtful comments.